sense? I should have recorded that for everyone. Well, yeah, it's 5 past now, isn't it? Unless I'm just checking my clock. So I guess we'd better get started. So today we're going to talk about book 2 of the genealogy, and then tomorrow. And then we've got to decide whether we want to kind of finish off the genealogy after spring break, or whether we want to kind of miss the last book of the genealogy and go into Nietzsche. So I'd go into start immediately with Wittgenstein, and I'm happy either way. Okay, so where is the genealogy? Yeah, so I think like book 2 starts properly at section 4. I think the stuff up to section 4 is a bit waffly, and I think the main sort of theme of the second book begins really on section 4. And you ask what's going on in the earlier sections? What are they doing there? What's their function? Last time we talked about the idea of the sovereign individual, and everyone's confused about the sovereign individual. What he just mentions it once in section 2, is it? And then it doesn't come up again. Section 4 comes to I think the topic of the section. How did that other somber thing, the consciousness of guilt, the bad conscience, come into the world? Yeah. So we have guilt, we have bad conscience. I sort of take it that Nietzsche uses bad conscience and guilt interchangeably. Yeah. One thing you might think is, does Nietzsche, if guilt is sort of bad conscience, is there another kind of conscience that doesn't have these negative sides to it? Can you have conscience without this sort of feeling of guilt? It's not obvious what Nietzsche thinks there. And so he's going to offer a story about the origin of guilt, the feeling of guilt. And he's kind of the big story. I think it's got a bunch of different elements, but the big story I think is fairly sort of simple, that the feeling of guilt is pain that's interpreted as punishment. Yeah, so you've got some pain and you interpret this pain as punishment. Yep. And so in order to offer this theory about guilt, he's got to say a bit about punishment. So he starts off having a discussion of the origin of punishment, and it turns out he thinks that the sort of pain that we interpret as punishment is the sort of, I think he thinks primarily is this pain of repression that we get as animals living in a civilized condition, where we're not able to act on all of our drives. Yeah, as domesticated animals, we've got like the drives of wild animals, but we're sort of living in a zoo. Yeah, we can't roam around, we can't act on all of our desires, we have to constrain ourselves. This causes frustration. And then the thought is we interpret this as punishment. Yeah, that's what guilt is. It's pain interpreted as punishment. And one of the things that Nietzsche was concerned with throughout his life was pain. So Schopenhauer thought pain and suffering basically meant that led to his, was one of the things that sort of led to his pessimistic view of life. You know, life is willing, and to will is to desire, and to desire is to lack, it's to feel pain, and pain is bad. And so Schopenhauer took the existence of pain as ubiquitous, and he also took it to kind of undermine the value of existence. Because of pain, existence has a negative valuation for Schopenhauer. Existence, being born, is bad, Schopenhauer thinks. The best thing would never to have been born, because our life is just a life of pain, suffering, boredom, followed by death. And Nietzsche was very worried. Like in his youth, he was very influenced by Schopenhauer, but he came to kind of reject Schopenhauer's pessimism. Yeah, so he wanted to have a philosophy of life affirmation. And in order to do this, he's got to kind of, in some sense, offer a way of justifying pain. Yeah, and the conclusion Nietzsche came to is that pain in and of itself is not particularly bad. Yeah, we tend to think pain is bad, but pain in itself isn't bad. What's bad is sort of meaningless pain. Yeah, meaningless suffering. If suffering can be given a meaning, then it sort of stops being bad. And so I think Nietzsche thinks that it's this what drives us to interpret pain as punishment, because we have a problem with meaningless suffering, meaningless pain. But if we can give our pain a meaning, then this is a way of sort of redeeming it, of giving it some sort of value. But Nietzsche thinks that this particular way of interpreting and giving meaning to pain is a way of giving meaning to pain that itself is just a cause of an ever more concentric circles of increasing pain. So this is the big picture. So guilt is pain interpreted as suffering, as punishment, and therefore to offer an account of the origin of guilt, we have to first of all say something about punishment. So in this first section, he sort of begins this, and he says, have these genealogists of morals even had the remotest suspicion that the major moral concept, Schuld, guilt, has its origin in the very material concept, Schulden, debts. So in German, the word for guilt is connected for the word of being in debt. Yeah. How does this work in Turkish? What's the Turkish for? Is there a Turkish for guilt?
Suçluluk.
And is such connected to anything like repayment or?
Kefaret gibi bir şey mi acaba?
Kefaret. No.
Kefaret? Is that a word for guilt or for debt?
For debt.
Okay. So the Turkish for like guilt is not in any, is it connected to punishment in any way or to?
Yes, you do a crime and you pay for it, like the consequence of it.
Yeah. So it's used in the legal sense and then in this psychological sense, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in English, kind of to be guilty is both a sort of moral concept referring to a sort of feeling, but it's also a legal concept of being guilty of a crime. In German, he notes that the German word for guilt is tied to the idea of debt, and this is something he's going to look at. And it's going to turn out that he thinks that that punishment started off being connected to the notion of debt. Yeah, so this idea of paying back a debt, this is how he thinks that punishment emerged. So we're going to look at what he says. So on the one hand, guilt is related etymologically, at least in German, to the idea of debts. And secondly, he says that punishment as requital evolved quite independently of any presupposition concerning freedom or non-freedom of the will. Yeah, the practice of punishment, it's going to turn out, started off as a practice that developed prior to any notion of guilt. yeah, prior to any notion of bad conscience or guilt. So, so he starts this discussion with the idea of punishment. And he says that throughout the greater part of human history, so for now, for the next like 6 or 7 sections, the major, or 7 or 8 sections, the major topic is about punishment, and then he returns back to this discussion of guilt. And he says, through the greater part of the human history, punishment was not imposed because one held the wrongdoer responsible for his deeds, thus not on the presupposition that only the guilty one should be punished. So today, our understanding of punishment is that punishment is something we do to a guilty party. So given the way we think of punishment today, that punishment is tied to the notion of guilt, to the idea that only the guilty should be punished. And if this were true about the origin of punishment, then you couldn't use the idea of punishment to explain the notion of guilt. Yeah. But I take it that so he's going to offer, he wants to offer an account of the origin of the practice of punishment that doesn't rest upon a prior understanding of the concept of guilt. That the concept of guilt emerged much later than the practice of punishment. This is kind of, I think, a central claim. He says, rather, as parents still punish their children from anger at some harm or injury. I'm not sure. I'm not sure that's right about children anymore. Vented on the one who caused it, but this anger is held in check and modified by the idea that every injury has its equivalent and can actually be paid back, if only through the pain of the culprit. Yeah. So he takes it that the notion of punishment is going to turn out emerged through the idea of a certain type of repayment. Yeah. So that you owe me something. Maybe I've borrowed something, I can't pay it back. You owe me something, and instead of repaying me in money, I get to cause you harm. Yeah. So that the pain of the culprit, yeah, is punishment is a way of being repaid for something by the culprit, or the person who's the debtor's pain. And Nietzsche thinks that this is quite, there's something quite ironic about this, because let's suppose like I've borrowed 100 lira from you and I haven't paid it back. Actually, it's like, that's like borrowing $1 or something. I don't know. So let's suppose I've borrowed some real money. So like I've borrowed $100 from you and I can't pay it back to you. I promised to pay it back and I can't pay it back to you. Then I get the right, instead of being repaid in money, I'm allowed to hurt you. I'm allowed to cause you pain. And somehow causing you pain is the equivalent of $100. Causing this pain is a way of being paid back something. And how can causing someone pain be worth $100? What does Nietzsche think? Any thoughts? Did anyone read this? So Nietzsche thinks we have this idea of an equivalence between injury and pain. It starts in the contractual relationship between the creditor and the debtor. Yeah, so and then we have this sort of paradox that he looks at in the next section. So the origin of punishment had its origin in the relationship of creditor and debtor, that you've borrowed something from me and you can't repay it. And instead of being repaid the money I'm owed, I get to hurt you. And Nietzsche thinks that this story, if this story is true, it shows that in some sense, inflicting suffering on others is something that has a value for us. It's something that gives us a sort of pleasure. So that the individuals enjoy inflicting suffering on others. And he thinks in particular, if you're someone who is in society who's sort of poor and weak, that you're the sort of person who's going to get most pleasure from this, especially if the person you make suffer is someone rich and successful. Yeah. So there's a sort of pleasure in dominating others, Nietzsche thinks. And this is a pleasure, this sort of getting pleasure from this stuff is stronger, the sort of weaker and less powerful you are. Yep. If you're not able to express yourself freely in general, being allowed to punish someone because they can't pay you back is a sort of festival or a carnival. Yeah. So he says there, well, so in what way can causing someone suffering repay you or compensate you for a loss? Someone's hasn't paid you money back, someone's killed your friend or your family, then you're allowed to hurt them. And this is supposed to be some sort of repayment. And what's the logic of this sort of repayment? And so this is Nietzsche on page 64 to 65. He says, let us be clear as to the logic of this form of compensation. It is strange enough. An equivalence is provided by the creditors receiving, in place of a literal compensation for an injury. Yeah, instead of getting money, you get to hurt someone. That's in place of money, land, or possessions of any kind, a recompense of repayment in the form of a kind of pleasure. Yep, the pleasure of being allowed to vent his power freely on one who is powerless. The voluptuous pleasure of doing evil for the pleasure of doing it. The enjoyment of violation. And this enjoyment will be the greater, the lower the creditor stands in the social order, and can most easily appear to him as a most delicious morsel, indeed as a foretaste of higher rank. In punishing the debtor, the creditor participates in the right of the masters. Yeah, so by being allowed to punish someone else, that you stand in a position of superiority to them. Yeah, and there's this pleasure of sort of status. Yep, especially if you're someone who in normal life doesn't have very much status, then you're allowed to kind of inflict suffering on this person. At last, he too may experience for once the exalted sensation of being allowed to despise and mistreat someone as beneath him. Or at least, if the actual power and administration of punishment has already passed to the authorities, to see him despised and mistreated. Yeah, so the compensation that then, so in what way can causing someone else suffering repay you for a loss, consists in a warrant for and title to cruelty. Yeah, the pleasure, yeah, that insofar as punishment started off as a form of repayment, the only way it can function as a form of repayment is if causing suffering to the debtor gives you something of value. Yeah, so this is Nietzsche's play. Nietzsche thinks that suffering is bad, but he suggests that making suffer, yeah, also has a form of joy in it. Yeah, so pain is bad, suffering is bad, but making suffer is sort of good. Yeah. So he says, to what extent can suffering balance debts or guilt? to the extent that to make suffer was in the highest degree pleasurable, to the extent that the injured party exchanged for the loss he has sustained, including the displeasure caused by the loss, an extraordinary counterbalancing pleasure, that of making suffer, a genuine festival. Yeah, something which, as aforesaid, was prized more highly the more violently it contrasted with the rank and social standing of the creditor. And so Nietzsche thinks that we're animals who enjoy, and I think Nietzsche here wants to be in some sense neutral. It's supposed to be a description of what human animals are like. But I think from the perspective of Christian morality, this is quite a disgusting aspect of human nature. But Nietzsche, I think, thinks that it's this aspect of human nature that lies behind the origin, the emergence of this Christian morality. And it turns out that Nietzsche thinks that if we are not able to exert our power externally and dominate others, then we can get this pleasure by turning it inwards and sort of dominating and torturing ourselves. And so the emergence of conscience, I take it, at least part of the aspect, it emerges through this sort of self-torture, yeah, where we're not allowed to impose our will on the world, to violently impose our will on the world around us, but instead we sort of impose our will on ourselves. Yeah, that we sort of torture ourselves. And Nietzsche thinks that this is the sort of origin of Christian morality. Yeah, there's a famous quote just a little bit up the page where he says, the categorical imperative smells of cruelty. Yeah, that Kantian morality involves cruelty to oneself, a sort of self-hatred, a self-torture, a self-overcoming. Now, yeah, so this idea of tying cruelty to the festival, that we're tame domestic animals. Then we have the kind of our wild ancestors, and it's difficult to us to comprehend the degree to which cruelty constituted the great festival pleasure of more primitive men. So in more kind of earlier societies, Nietzsche thinks that these sort of festivals of cruelty were a regular part of these worlds. So think about like gladiatorial shows in Rome, kind of think about ancient wars and epics, that finding an enemy and then slaughtering them, this was a kind of fun day out. This is what you did for entertainment. And what he finds is that as we live in societies in which the relationship between human beings is governed by laws, and people's violent instincts are not allowed to express themselves, this cruelty, instead of being released in a sort of physical way, is sort of spiritualized. Yeah. He says in Beyond Good and Evil, he pointed cautiously to the ever-increasing spiritualization and deification of cruelty, which permeates the entire history of higher culture. So the sort of higher culture, I take it both art and morality, and yeah, involves, Nietzsche thinks, is an expression of this sort of aggressive will to cruelty turned inwards rather than turned outwards. This is the sort of origin of Freud's idea of sublimation. People know about Freud's idea of, yeah, when our drives are, sorry, that we've just lost the electricity. When our drives are sort of repressed, this can either lead to neurosis or it can lead to art. Am I still connected? Can you hear me? That all the electricity has gone here. Hello?
We can hear you.
Okay, cool. I just wanted to check. Okay. So I'm sort of in the dark here. Now, yeah, so these sections he talks about cruelty. In section 7, I take it these sections are partly engaging with Schopenhauer, as I tried to allude to earlier on. So Schopenhauer takes suffering to be the great sort of question mark against life. Yeah. And so in section 7, I think he kind of finally kind of comes out with it. That he's been talking about the kind of festival of suffering, about the joys involved in cruelty and domination. And I take it that when he's talking about this domination and cruelty, I think he's not just, I think that this involves imposing our will on things. Yeah, so this drive to domination, one expression of this is in warfare and just primal aggression. But I take it in art, in creation, there's a bit of the world out there and you impose your will upon it. You sort of dominate it, you inform it, you actively sculpt it. So I take it that this drive to dominate, one expression of this is going to be something like physical violence and aggression. But I think he thinks that there's a sort of continuum and that the desire to shape things, yeah, that's what the will is. And that's a sort of drive to dominate as well. So the artist, in creating some sort of object, is sort of dominating the material. It's an exercise of will, of domination, of expression. Yeah. So, and this is kind of, it's a way of imposing one's will on the external world. And so I think this discussion, one of the big interlocutors here is Schopenhauer. And Schopenhauer, of course, had this philosophy of pessimism. And one of the big question marks was suffering. And he says, let me declare expressly that in these days, when mankind was not yet ashamed of its cruelty, life on earth was much more cheerful than it is now that pessimism exists. Yeah, we have this increasing self-shame. So these aspects of human nature that for earlier generations were just accepted as part of the human condition, and now things that we're sort of ashamed at. Yeah, and so one of the things about modernity or modern world is that we're basically ashamed, Nietzsche thinks, to be human animals. Yeah, and this is, I think, something that he wants to react to, that there's this increase in man's feeling of shame at man. Yeah, the weary, pessimistic glance, mistrust of the riddle of life, the icy no of disgust with life. Yeah, that these do not characterize the most evil epochs of the human race. Rather, they first step into the light of day as the swampy weeds they are when the swamp into which they belong comes into being. Yeah, these are aspects of this kind of moralized modern human being. Yeah, this sort of self-shame. Yeah. Yeah.
There's no electricity.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's electricity.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, so sorry. You can do it. You say bye-bye.
You will have dinner and then.
Okay. Say bye-bye. Oh, oh yeah. It's my chickens. You say hello. Oops. Look. He's waving. Are you waving? Yeah. Wavy, wavy. Oh, look. She's got a little hand there. She's waving back. Oh.
So you knew there were no electricity, right?
Yeah.
Okay. I just realized it.
Okay.
I don't. Okay. İyi dersler.
Okay. Bye. Sorry about that. Yeah. Here I've got one of those. Do people have these? I've got a special to my Wi-Fi. I've got a little kind of battery pack that is charged by the wall, and it lasts for about 3 or 4 hours. If there's a power cut, it's quite useful. Yeah, so that with modern man has kind of learned, I mean, the morbid softening and moralization through which the animal man finally learns to be ashamed of all his instincts. Yes, I think he thinks that, and this is a sort of expression of what we might think of as a certain type of sort of self-hatred. And this self-hatred is itself emerges through, Nietzsche thinks, ironically. So we have the hatred of our instincts of hatred, yeah, but this itself is an expression of the instinct to kind of hate things. Yeah, so the disgust at our pleasure at causing suffering is a manifestation of our drive to cause suffering. Nietzsche thinks that isn't expressed outwards, but is turned inwards. Yeah. So he says, when suffering is always brought forward as the principal argument against existence, as the worst question mark, one does well to recall the ages in which the opposite opinion prevailed, because men were unwilling to refrain from making suffer and saw in it an enactment of the first order, a genuine seduction to life. Yeah. So this idea of suffering and making suffer, I mean, to suffer is to be passive. Yeah, to suffer is to be acted upon. Yeah, to act. So you have, whenever there's an action, there's something acted upon. So whenever there's an action, something suffers, something is passive. Yeah, so suffering involves being sort of acted upon. Yeah, and then we're kind of worried about being passive, being acted upon, and Nietzsche's sort of like, well, maybe the value of expressive activity is compensates for the disvalue of this suffering being acted upon. Passion, yeah, once again, I think passion is tied to being passive. So passion is another word for suffering. We have the passion of Jesus, the passion of Christ, which is the suffering of Christ. But once again, it's also tied to being acted upon, being passive. Yeah. So we have I think we have the idea that we have an activity of willing, and willing is always an active power. And whenever there's an active power, there's something acted upon. Yeah. Whenever this is one of Schopenhauer's examples. Schopenhauer said, the life, like for every eating, there's something that's being eaten. Yeah. And the pain of being eaten really outweighs the pleasure of eating. Like eating is a little bit pleasurable, being eaten is really bad. So if all eating involves something being eaten, then overall the total effect is sort of negative. Yeah. And I think this is the sort of type of argument here that Nietzsche, this sort of Schopenhauerian argument, is the sort of thing that Nietzsche is reacting in. He wants to react against. And I think he thinks that it turns out that suffering is not in itself so bad. Yeah, so he says, yeah, he says that you know, he thinks that pain did not hurt in the past as much as it hurts now. Yeah, that an educated American undergraduate is far more capable of feeling suffering, he thinks, yeah, of being very acutely aware of very minor pains. Do you know these stories about the princess and the pea? Is that a Turkish? Do you have that story in Turkey? You know, the princess who can't sleep because if there's a pea under the mattress, and then she has 20 mattresses and she still can't sleep because of the pea's so annoying. Whereas you might think a peasant is just like, oh, look, there's some floor. So I think he thinks that modern human beings are more acutely aware of pain. They physical pain. And I think he thinks that so pain itself is, in and of itself, is not particularly bad. You know, if you go to the gym and you're on the machines, you have this pain, but you sort of like it because you feel that you're growing muscle. Yeah. So you know, pain in and of itself, Nietzsche thinks, is not particularly a bad thing. He says what really arouses indignation against suffering is not suffering as such, but the senselessness of suffering, meaningless suffering. Yeah. And so and he thinks that if we look at value systems, we can think of different value systems as one of the kind of key driving forces in the creation of sets of values is a sort of an attempt to give meaning to suffering. Yeah. So, and he thinks that Christianity offers one way of giving meaning to suffering. Yeah. So, you know, but in Christianity, who has interpreted a whole mysterious machinery of salvation into suffering. And so he's going to look at the Christian way of offering an interpretation of suffering. And this is going to be the rest of this chapter is going to argue that we interpret suffering as punishment, as sin, as guilt, and there's a whole story there. And this story, it's a creative act, and what it does is it gives meaning to the suffering in our life. He says that in ancient times, the ancient men, I think he's thinking of the sort of Greeks, also needed to give meaning to suffering. And he now offers this sort of another view of suffering. So, you know, the Greeks had the idea that sort of a lot of suffering was entertainments for the gods. Yeah, so the kind of suffering, human life is like a theater, and the gods are up there watching the lives of human beings as sort of entertainment. Yeah, and so he thinks that the ancient Greeks had this, rather than interpreting suffering in moral terms, I take it the thought is that they did it in aesthetic terms. Yeah. Now, does Nietzsche want to return to something like this, the Greek account? And I think there is an aspect of that. So Nietzsche is, I think, quite romantic. And one of the things he thinks is that one thing we can do with our own suffering is to turn it into art. So I think he is part of his way of offering an account of how we can interpret our own suffering is that we can take our own suffering and use it as the material for creativity and art. We can, you know, Nietzsche went on holiday with his best mate and a girl, and he fell in love with the girl, and then she went off with his best mate, and he was really depressed, and he's up there in the mountains, he's sad. What does he do? Well, I'll go off and I'll write a masterwork. I'll write Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And so Nietzsche's pain became, I think, the sort of material for his art and his philosophy. Yeah. And I think I think this is a kind of sort of related to this Greek way of dealing with it, where suffering is given a sort of aesthetic meaning. Yeah. I think it's a bit different, but I think it's in the same sort of camp. So he says, nor for the naive man of more ancient times, who understood all suffering in relation to the spectator of it, or of the causer of it, was there any such thing as senseless suffering? And so suffering is made meaningful by its being visible. Yeah, that what gives he thinks that for the Greeks made suffering meaningful by making it a spectacle. Suffering is meaningful because they're the spectator. And this view of suffering then led to the need for sort of gods who could act as the sort of spectators of the theatre of human suffering. So he says, so as to abolish hidden, undetected, unwitnessed suffering from the world, and honestly to deny it, one was in the past virtually compelled to invent gods and genii of all the hidden heights and depths. In short, something that roams even in secret hidden places, sees even in the dark, and will not easily let an interesting, painful spectacle pass unnoticed. Yeah. And so here we've got the idea of suffering as a sort of interesting spectacle. Yeah, as something that is, you know, fun to watch or to, yeah, and this is one way to make the suffering meaningful. And I think Nietzsche's sort of personal attitude is that one can become the sort of spectator of one's own suffering. And this is a way of giving one suffering. Yeah, one can be the spectator of one's own suffering in a sort of aesthetic sense. Yeah, so I think that Nietzsche's sort of way of trying to give meaning to suffering, rather than trying to do it in these sort of moralistic terms that we find in Christianity, is to offer a sort of aesthetic way of dealing with suffering. Yeah, that we take one's, you know, we can think of one's life. One can think of one's life as a work of art. Yeah, that one's life is a sort of narrative, and then one can give particular pieces of suffering a place to play in that narrative we tell about ourselves. Yeah, I take it this is another way. But here I think he's offering, and this is something he returns to later, but I think in general that we've got the Christian, we're going to see a lot about the Christian way of interpreting suffering, the Judeo-Christian moralistic way of interpreting suffering. And I think here, by appealing to this Greek method, Nietzsche's sort of offering the glimpse of a sort of alternative way of giving meaning to suffering. Yeah, so he says the primitive logic. So he says, every evil, the sight of which edifies a god, is justified. That's suppose the primitive logic of feeling. Yeah, the gods conceived us as the friends of cruel spectacles. So the ancient gods, in some sense, when there are wars, these wars are, the gods are there sitting on the mountaintops, watching the wars and enjoying the spectacle. Yeah, and yeah, so he says, it is certain at any rate that the Greeks still knew of no tastier spice to offer their gods to season their happiness than the pleasure of cruelty. Yep. With what eyes do you think Homer made his gods look down upon the destinies of men? Yep. What was at bottom the ultimate meaning of Trojan wars and other such tragic terrors? Yeah, there can be no doubt whatsoever they were intended as festival plays for the gods. Yeah, and insofar as the poet in these matters of a more godlike disposition than other men, no doubt also as festival plays for the poets. So human suffering is a sort of is a spectacle for the gods, but also for artists, for the poets. Yeah, that the Greeks saw suffering. You know, the Greeks. Nietzsche's first book was on the birth of tragedy, the origin of tragic theatre. And, you know, the story he tells there is that tragedy emerged in these sort of festivals. So we have the idea of the drama as festival. And I think this is a sort of continuation of the sort of some of the ideas he developed in the birth of tragedy. Now, he's going to contrast, I think, this way. And I think he thinks that, so he has this sort of digression about cruelty, the pleasures, also the sort of pleasures of spectacle, the way in which suffering can be aestheticized. So think about like a Greek tragedy. Yeah, you go and watch a tragic drama, and that as a spectator, that you get a certain type of pleasure from watching the tragedy. But of course, what's happening in the tragedy is you've got someone who's suffering. You've got this great intensity of feeling and of suffering being presented to you on the stage. But as an audience member, it's a spectacle that's sort of enjoyable. So suffering can be given meaning by being put on a stage and being a spectacle that gives pleasure to the spectators. Yeah, and I think this is his account of the way in which the Greeks gave meaning to suffering. But I think he thinks that in the Christian period that there's this new interpretation. And I think he thinks that this new interpretation is essentially unhealthy. Okay, let's have a kind of, I've gone on for a bit much. Let's have a kind of 10-minute break, and then we'll come back after the break. Thank you. Hey, shall we get started again? Just give me a thumbs up if there's any. Okay, hello. Yeah, it's difficult to know if anyone's there at some point. It's like, yeah. I mean, if any of you got any questions or any comments, feel free, because it's a very small group. I've got stuff I wanted to talk about, but if there's anything you've got questions about, feel free just to interrupt me at any time. It's, you know, it's like a small graduate seminar size group at the moment. So feel free to interrupt me and go with any questions. I want to get, I mean, I think the most important sections in book 2 are 12 and 13, where he talks about punishment, and then number 16, where he talks about his own hypothesis. I think these are the two kind of big ones. I want to make sure we get to those, maybe not necessarily today, but I think 12 and 13 are sort of important. So I'm going to skip a little bit, but I just want to say one thing about what to make of Nietzsche. So far I've been presenting it as if Nietzsche is like, you know, human beings are just cruel animals who are driven by a drive to dominate and be cruel. And gee, we should just, you know, we shouldn't feel ashamed of our nature. And so cruelty and punishment are just good, and we should go back to this old way. Now, I think historically Nietzsche, I mean, in terms of, if you look throughout his works, I think one of the things that's striking is he's got an extremely negative attitude towards punishment. I think overall he thinks that that the desire to punish is an expression of weakness. And as a society and an individual is stronger, the less sort of need they have to punish and to sort of dominate. Yeah, the desire to dominate other people comes about through people who feel weak. Yeah, insofar as we are, in some sense, uninhibited and not repressed, I think he thinks there's going to be less need for punishment and actual cruelty to other human beings. So I think a lot of time, once I've said this a few times before, you can read Nietzsche as sort of very much on the right politically, as a sort of forerunner of fascism, valuing domination and strength. But I take it if you scratch below the surface, I think some of the stuff he says about punishment, in some sense, you can see how people like the Frankfurt School came out of him. That this desire to punish is a result of the sort of, and inflict cruelty is a result of the sort of repression we find in the sort of repressive societies we live in. And if human beings could be liberated from this type of repression, then this is going to lead to societies that are far less cruel, because people will because cruelty is an expression of repression and weakness. And I think number 10, I think it's worth having a little look at number 10 to give this other side. I think from what I've said so far, you might think Nietzsche just wants to say the urge to cruelty is just a natural part of human nature. I think he does think that we have these sort of instincts to express ourselves, this what he calls the will to power. And I think one manifestation of this is the pleasure we get from cruelty. But I think another manifestation of this is the pleasure we get from artistic creation. Yeah, the pleasure we get from being active in general. So there's various ways this will to power can manifest itself in a sort of drive to cruelty, but it also can do so in this sort of artistic creation. Yeah, and he says, as its power increases, a community ceases to take the individual's transgressions so seriously, because they can no longer be considered as dangerous and destructive to the whole as they were formerly. So the stronger a society is, the less harsh the punishment is, because transgressions are less damaging, potentially damaging to the community. So you have strong penal codes. The weaker the society, the stronger the punishment needs to be. Yeah. If you're living in a small, medieval community that's threatened from outside and you don't have a very strong legal system, then you want the punishments to be really hard. If you've got a society in which people are generally law-abiding and the society is quite strong, then the punishment doesn't need to be as strong. So he says, as the power and self-confidence of a community increase, the penal law always becomes more moderate. Yeah, and so as a kind of a harsh penal law is a sort of expression of the weakness of a society. So every weakening or imperiling of a society, it leads to kind of harsher forms of punishment. Yeah, the creditor always becomes more humane to the extent that he's grown richer. Yeah, it's the poor person who's filled with ressentiment. Yeah, and the rich, the powerful, don't really have much need of inflicting. They just do what they want. Yeah, but the sort of poor, powerless person in society, they're the one who wants to kind of, they're the ones who are at Trump rallies chanting, lock her up. They're the ones calling for blood. And Nietzsche suggests in section 10 that it is not unthinkable that a society might attain such a consciousness of power that it could allow itself the noblest luxury possible to it, letting those who harm go unpunished. What are my parasites to me, it might say. May they live and prosper. I'm strong enough for that. Yeah. And he sort of he finishes off by saying this self-overcoming of justice, one knows the new beautiful name, it has given itself mercy. It goes without saying that mercy remains the privilege of the most powerful man, or better, he's beyond the law. Yeah, so mercy is going to be an expression of strength, of sovereignty. And Kaufman in his notes, I think has an interesting passage from Dawn, for example. And here I think this really is Nietzsche speaking in his own voice. Yeah, I think in the genealogy, it's far more ironic. It's difficult to know when Nietzsche is endorsing something. But he says, let us eliminate. And so dawn, sometimes translated as daybreak. I think it's, so one way I think of reading Nietzsche is as someone who sees himself as sort of in daybreak as the sort of culmination of the Enlightenment. Yeah, that the Enlightenment hasn't gone far enough. Yeah, because it hasn't questioned its own values. This is something we'll see in the next thing. But he says, let us eliminate the concept of sin from the world, and let us soon dispatch the concept of punishment after it. May these exiled monsters live somewhere else henceforth and not among men, if they insist on living and will not perish of disgust with themselves. Shouldn't we be mature enough yet? So grown up enough, enlightened, think about Kant's idea of enlightenment as a sort of maturity. Shouldn't we be mature enough yet for the opposite view? Shouldn't we be able to say yet, every guilty person is sick, not in need of punishment, in need of curing? No, the hour for that has not yet come. As yet, the physicians are lacking above all. As yet, no thinker has had the courage of measuring the health of a society and of individuals according to how many parasites they can stand. And this is, I think, this quote here about parasites. I think Nietzsche is what are my parasites? To me, this is an allusion back, I think, from this quote from Daybreak. Yeah. So I think that his distaste for guilt, punishment, and retribution is a sort of underlying theme of the whole of the genealogy. Remember last time we looked at the beasts of prey, the birds of prey and the lamb section, where he criticizes and sort of rejects this notion of free will and responsibility. And I think there, once again, I think this attack on the notion of moral responsibility is tied to this kind of attack on the idea of punishment and guilt. That a society that is sort of believes in freedom of the will, moral responsibility, there's something unhealthy about this. Yeah, and that we need a system of values that goes beyond the idea of moral responsibility, that sort of gets rid of it. If we are just bits of fate, I think there's sort of something Spinocistic. Spinoza and Nietzsche both, I think, in some sense, reject freedom of will, and then also want to reject these sort of notions of responsibility and replace them with notions of sort of health. Yeah, what's important is something more like health, that the person who we regard as evil, we might think, or as bad, or the criminal, is sort of sick. So I think this is the sort of what I take to be one might think of as the more sort of progressive side of Nietzsche. Okay. So punishment emerged then. So he's told this story about the emergence of punishment, and punishment emerged in terms of this relationship between creditor and debtor, and that we had the practice whereby individuals were allowed to inflict suffering on debtors as a way of being repaid. Yeah. Now, we might think that then Nietzsche thinks then this in and of itself shows that punishment is bad. And I think though, and he's also going to offer an account of, Christian morality has its origin in the feeling of ressentiment. And you might think, well, doesn't this sort of origin story undermine the current meaning and value we place on these kind of Christian ideas? And I think it's quite important to kind of recognize that Nietzsche thinks that this story about origins doesn't in and of itself give us a reason to reject the ethics. It may function rhetorically to undermine something about these Christian ethics. But I think Nietzsche is quite self-aware that the fact that something has its origin from a certain in a thing that's bad doesn't mean that the thing that now exists is a bad thing. Yeah, so think about states, nation states. Maybe I'm wrong, but it seems to me that pretty much any nation state that has come into existence came into existence through injustice. If you look at the history of the emergence of any state and state formation, they're just striven with injustice. Now, for most states, the injustice or most of the injustice occurred a long time ago. New states, I think, that the injustice is more recent and more obvious. But it seems to me that every state has its origin in injustice. No, I think that's probably true. Does that mean that states as they exist now are somehow unjust? I don't think so. I think one can kind of value the states that exist, whilst at the same time thinking that all states have their origin in injustice. What do people think? Like, I think you can be a sort of Turkish nationalist and think that the origin of the state, it emerged. Yeah, that you can think the British state, being English, being British, that think about colonialism, think about the British imperialism, the state as it exists now. There was a period when you had the slave trade. America as a state, it started off in the genocide of Native Americans. So I think you look at any particular state, and that for the state to come into existence has involved injustice. But this doesn't necessarily undermine the legitimacy of any current state now. So the sort of status, the current status of a state and the story of its origins, I think, are two separate things. Think about Israel. So I think that on the one hand, Israel came into existence at the expense of committing injustice towards the Palestinians. But at the same time, I think that, that the state does have as much right to exist as any other state, because all states have their origin in injustice. It's just with Israel, the injustice is a bit earlier. So I think the question of the origin of something and the question of its current status, I think Nietzsche is right. We have to kind of separate these two things. And this may lead you then to ask, well, what is achieved through a genealogy? So in the genealogy, in some sense, you might think that the genealogy is an attempt to offer the account of the origin of something. But if the origin of something and its purpose or meaning are really quite distinct, what do we learn from a genealogy? So sections 12 and 13, I think, are quite important. And I think they're not just about punishment. I think they're about general methodological themes in Nietzsche. So he says, yet a word on the origin and purpose of punishment. Now, so we've got two problems that are separate or ought to be separate. So we need to distinguish between the origin of something and its purpose. And I think very often when something has a purpose, we think it emerged to serve that purpose. But Nietzsche wants to tell a story whereby the reason something emerged and the purpose it serves today can be quite distinct. So learning about the origin of something doesn't tell us about the purpose. And very often things emerge and then acquire purposes once they've come into existence. Yeah. So these are really important methodological issues. He says, unfortunately, they are usually confounded. The question of the origin of something and its purpose or meaning are often mistaken. He says, how have previous genealogists of morals set about solving these problems? Naively, as has always been their way. So the people like Paul Ray, these English psychologists, as he called them, they seek out some purpose in punishment, and then they think that the reason punishment emerges is to serve this purpose. And Nietzsche thinks this is wrong. He says, naively has always been their way. They seek out some purpose in punishment, for example, revenge or deterrence, and then guilelessly place this purpose at the beginning as a cause of being, cause of the origin of punishment, and have done. So they basically engage in these naive genealogists, confuse the idea of the origin of something with the purpose. Yeah, and they're committed to a certain type of teleological explanation, where they think that the purpose of something, is its cause. Yeah, so Dorit, you just came. We're looking at Essay 2, Section 12, and Nietzsche is really making a very important methodological point in here in 12 and 13, telling us that we shouldn't confuse the origin of something with its purpose. And this is a general methodological claim, and its purpose or its meaning. And he thinks that these, I think Paul Ray and the people he's criticizing, that they tend to identify the purpose with the cause of the origin of the thing. Yeah, the purpose of the law. So he says, so where is this? Oh yeah. Yeah, he says the purpose of law, however, is absolutely the last thing to employ in the history of origin of law. So it's only once you've got law that it can acquire purposes. I think here Nietzsche is quite like Hume. So if any of you have read Hume's treatise on the emergence of justice, that you have these conventions that emerge, and once these conventions have emerged, one can think, oh, that's a good thing. Yeah. So you've got people kind of learning how to row a boat together, and they get themselves in sync. And then once they've got in sync, they can then decide to stay in sync. But you get, in some sense, the practice emerges first. And then one can, it's only once one's got the practice that then one can decide how to evaluate it. Yeah, yeah. So he says, the cause of the origin of a thing and its eventual utility, its actual employment and place in a system of purposes lie worlds apart. Yeah, so we have these sort of practices, and our story of, he thinks, and I think there is a sort of empiricism here that I think he shares with Hume. I think he thinks that practices sort of emerge, and it's only once they're there that we can then evaluate them. It's not like, first of all, we come up with an abstract idea of rowing a boat together and then put it into practice. We kind of do stuff together, and we end up sometimes synchronizing and then thinking, oh, this is quite good for these reasons, let's carry on doing it. So that the reasons for our practices only normally emerge after the practices themselves. So practices, collective practices, are things that emerge prior to, don't arrive because people deliberately decide to bring them into existence. But we have these sort of practices that emerge that then we're able to evaluate. I think this is like Hume's account of the origin of justice. I think Hume would buy into this. So he says, the cause of the origin of a thing and its eventual utility, its actual employment and place in a system of purposes lie worlds apart. Whatever exists, having somehow come into being, is again and again reinterpreted to new ends, taken over, transformed, and redirected by some power superior to it all. Yeah. All events in the organic world are a subduing, a becoming master. And all subduing and becoming master involves fresh interpretation and adaptation, through which any previous meaning and purpose are necessarily obscured or even obliterated. Now, I think this is a bit of a kind of wordy discussion. Yeah, but yeah, so we have these sort of practices, and then that I think what's interesting here, this idea of becoming master, this will to power, this will to domination. I take it here he's suggesting that one thing, that one way of becoming master is by offering an interpretation of something, by giving something meaning. Yeah, so we've got something out there that is we don't understand. It overpowers us. But through giving it an interpretation, we can become master. Okay, so sorry about that. Yeah, I think there must have been my internet connection. Just let me just check it's working. Yeah, so yeah, so let me find the yeah, so giving meaning to something is a way of controlling it, yeah, of dominating it, of making it mine. This is something you find in sort of Hegel. You've got this idea of alienation. You've got something external to you that is absolutely other. And then coming to understand it is a way of making it yours. Yeah, so you've got something alien that you can make yours by comprehending it in thought. Yeah. Now Hegel's got this idea that there's some objectivity here, that it's a matter of understanding being. I think Nietzsche has got a view that's analogous to Hegel's view, but rather than being a matter of kind of coming to know it, that what we have are just interpretations. And these interpretations are changing all the time, yeah, dependent on our needs and our drives. Yeah, so whenever there's a sort of social practice, it's going to turn out there's going to be two things. There's going to be a set of practices, and these practices are things that change quite slowly. Yeah, but then we've got our interpretations of these practices, and our interpretations of, say, social reality is something that is constantly in flux. Yeah, we're always reinterpreting the world as a way of becoming master, as a way of dominating and controlling and understanding and being at home in the world, as a way of overcoming alienation. Yeah, we overcome alienation by taking control of things, by owning things, and we own them by interpreting them, by giving meaning to them. And by giving meaning to something, we fit it into a system of meanings. Yeah, we sort of appropriate it into our, yeah, it stops being something alien. Yeah, this is I think the idea. But then what happens is that what we find with these practices, we have generations who have kind of constantly been reinterpreting things. So when it comes to the meaning of something like punishment, we find it's got just layers and layers of various interpretations. There's not one true interpretation of the meaning of punishment. There's a whole set of meanings that have become connected to and alloyed with the social practice over generations. And some of them are more central to us, but in the sense of the meaning of punishment, all of these various interpretations are there in the archaeology of the concept. Yeah, so part of, so he says, yeah, so we have these old meanings, and then on top of these, we impose our own meanings. Yeah, so he says, however well one has understood the utility of any physiological organ, or a legal institution, a social custom, a political usage, a form in art, or in a religious code, this means nothing regarding its origin. So the current meaning of something is not likely to be a good guide to its origin, because we are interpreting animals. Yeah, we are, and this is part of what Nietzsche calls the will to power, the will to dominate, the will to control, the will to become master. Yeah, that we impose meaning on an hostile external world to make the world less hostile and alien. Yeah. However uncomfortable and disagreeable this may sound to older ears, for one has always believed that to understand the demonstrative purpose, the utility of a thing, a form or an institution, was also to understand the reason why it originated. The eye being made for seeing, the hand for grasping. Yeah. And traditionally, one also imagined that punishment was devised for punishing. Yeah, so the sort of standard view is, why does punishment exist? Well, in order to punish people. The purpose of punishment is to punish people, yeah, for their wrongs. But he says purposes and utilities. I take it that by purposes and utilities, he means sort of meanings, interpretations, are only signs that a will to power has become master of something less powerful. Yeah, so the sort of meanings that are given to things are expressions of this will to power. Now, what exactly Nietzsche means by the will to power here? This is one of the big questions in Nietzsche scholarship. He had this big volume that was published after his death by his Nazi sister, yeah, on the will to power. But I take it that we've got this will, that we have these various drives, and the interpretations we give to things are sort of functions of our dominant drives. I take it that's the sort of idea. And these change in individuals, they change in history. Yeah. So we have these various drives. And I think Nietzsche thinks that interpretations are always in the service of some drive or will or the like. Yeah. So that we interpret things in certain ways to serve our purposes, where we're understanding purposes not in terms of represented ends, but in terms of the purposes of particular drives or aspects of our character. Yeah, so he says there are only signs. These are signs that a will to power has become master of something less powerful. I take it the will to power, we've got these different drives, and imposed upon it the character of a function. Yeah, so the entire history of a thing, an organ, a custom, can this way be a continuous sign change of ever new interpretations and adaptations whose causes do not even have to be related to one another, but on the contrary, in some cases, succeed and alternate with one another in a purely chance fashion. Yeah, so we have these sort of interpretations, and the practice is relatively stable, but these interpretations are a sort of mess. Yeah, there's not necessarily a strong internal logic about why one interpretation was dominant and then replaced by another. It might be that, that society has changed from an aristocratic to a capitalist society, and therefore the needs of the dominant class push a certain interpretation of punishment as the sort of dominant interpretation. So as the forces in society compete with one another and different forces, different groups become dominant, the sort of dominant interpretations of particular practices change. Yeah, and in some cases, these sort of interpretations succeed and alternate with one another in a purely chance fashion. So there's not necessarily a sort of logic of how these concepts develop and these meanings develop in time. This is very un-Hegelian. So the drive to interpret, the drive we might think of as quite Hegelian, in the sense that it's an attempt to overcome something like alienation by imposing an interpretation. But Hegel's got this idea that this works through ever more accurate concepts, that where we have more and more knowledge, a better and better conceptual grasp of reality. And so we might be able to tell a story about how our interpretations grow increasingly accurate. And therefore, we might tell a progressive story about the history of our interpretations of a practice. Because I think he thinks that the interpretation is in the service of these drives, we've got these competing forces, we've got competing forces within an individual, we've got competing forces within a society, and the interpretations that become dominant are a function of which forces in society and an individual are dominant. Yeah, the history is sort of going to be messy. So unlike Hegel, who's got this idea that there's going to be some sort of progress, he says the evolution of a thing, a custom, an organ, is thus by no means its progress towards a goal. Even less a logical progress by the shortest route with the smallest expenditure of force. Yeah. So I suggested there's a sort of Hegelian element here, and then there's a very non-Hegelian element in terms of thinking that there's no logical story. We can't logically reconstruct the history of a concept in such a way that we can understand its development in these sort of logical terms. Now, so this is the kind of methodological introduction. And then, he says, let's now return to our subject, namely punishment. It's sort of like, hold on a minute, wasn't your subject bad conscience? Wasn't it guilt? Yeah, what is your subject? But let's return to our subject, namely punishment. He says we've got to distinguish two aspects. Yeah, so, and this, having set it up in the previous section, I think this should be quite clear. On the one hand, there is that in it which is relatively enduring, the custom, the act, the drama, a certain strict sequence of procedures. Yeah, so I take it this one aspect of punishment is what I've been calling the practice. You've got the kind of practice, and you have different stages in history where the practice is quite similar. Yeah, so you've got these various practices of punishing, and these, of course, the practices change over time. That we move from, whipping people to locking them up, but then you've got, but this is relatively enduring. That the practices change quite slowly. On the other hand, that in it which is fluid, yeah, which is kind of more quickly changing. The meaning, yeah, so, sorry. Yeah. The meaning, the purpose, the expectation associated with the performance of such procedures. Yeah, so, and in accordance with the previously developed major point of historical method, it is assumed without further ado that the procedure, the practice itself, will be something older, earlier than its employment in punishment. That the latter, the idea that the function of punishment is to punish the wrongdoer, the latter is projected and interpreted into the procedure. Yeah, so we have these practices that emerge, and in some sense they emerge for no reason. They emerge out of the bottom up. They don't emerge because people think it's a good idea to institute this practice, but people find themselves engaged in certain practices without really thinking about it. And then once these practices emerge, then as interpreting animals, we then try and give a meaning to the practice. And it's going to turn out that our interpretations of the practice are then going to affect the way in which the practice as practice evolves. Yeah, so it's going to be quite a complicated historical story. We have these social practices that emerge not for any reasons, because one can't, in some sense, this is an empiricist point, I think, one can't, in some sense, have a representation of the practice until it's come into existence and one has experienced the practice. It's only once you've got a practice that we can have the concept of the practice or the representation of it. And so the cause of a practice can't be the thought that wouldn't it be a good idea to have this practice. That's a sort of empiricist side, I think, of Nietzsche's argument here. Yeah, but then once we've got the practice, the meaning is then projected and interpreted into the procedure. Yeah, the procedure which has long existed, but been employed in another sense. In short, that the case is not, as has been hitherto assumed by our naive genealogists of laws and morals, who have one and all thought that the procedure is invented for the purpose of punishing. So here we have a sort of rationalist view that first of all, we have the concept of punishment that exists independent of the practice. And then we introduce the practice because we recognize that this concept is something that should be brought into existence. Yeah. And the purpose of the hand is not invented for the purpose of grasping. That you've got this thing that emerges through chance, chaos in evolution, but then maybe the reason hands are selected for is because they're used for grasping. But there's a story about why certain organs come into existence, and then the selection pressures are going to involve, some aspect of this. So these are the two elements. We're almost at the end. And I think the next bit I would like to do at the beginning of next class, because I think this is a really central claim. So I'll just mention it now. So he's got this I think he's got a very nice claim here. He says, only that which has no history is definable. Yeah. And so Nietzsche, I think, like Wittgenstein in the Tractatus, in the Investigations, not in the Tractatus, Wittgenstein thinks that our concepts don't have definitions. That you've got something like a game, and you've got a family resemblances between all things that fall under the concept. There's not a set of necessary and sufficient conditions. I think Nietzsche has got Nietzsche thinks that you're only going to get definitions for things that don't have a history. Because anything that's got a history is going to have a whole set of overlapping definitions, as we've seen. And so there's not going to be one. So anything with a history is going to turn out to be not definable. Yeah. And I want to start next class by talking about this passage, because I think this is really important. I think, yeah, and then I want to look at section 16 and, maybe 18. Yeah, so next class we'll look at as much of the rest of section 2 as possible. It's like we've got a few more minutes. I mean, if does any of you have any questions or thoughts, or otherwise we can finish. I don't mind either way. Feel free to. Any questions you've had about Nietzsche but have been too afraid to ask? Now might be the time. Oh, Saba, is that a question? You getting yourself? No. Okay, like if you haven't got any questions, then I'll see you tomorrow. Spring break is next week, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah. So tomorrow is the last class. So next class, you should tell me should we do another week of Nietzsche after and look at essay 3 after spring break, or should we jump straight into Wittgenstein?
Yeah, I was going to I was wondering how this genealogy of morals connect to nihilism, or it does not connect at all. So maybe you could recommend readings.
But nihilism. Okay, let me. So there's this guy. Oh, what's he called? Renigster. Let me have a look. So yeah, so there is a sort of literature on Nietzsche and nihilism. One thing I've read that isn't bad is Nietzsche on the affirmation of life, which is about overcoming nihilism. I think one of the so I mean, you might. I think you can just download this. But one thing is that let me just put it in the chat. I haven't read this review, but here's a book review. If you go to Phil Papers, there's lots of stuff on Nietzsche and nihilism. I could have a quick look now and tell you if I know anyone listed who I think is. But so there's a section on Nietzsche and nihilism. Yeah, man. Yeah, so I'm just seeing if I. I mean, there's a big literature on this. I'm just. I mean, my sort of understanding is that Nietzsche is a sort of enemy of nihilism. He thinks that he sees himself as a sort of, I don't know, a doctor that I think he thinks that nihilism that we're living through a sort of nihilistic time, a time of life denial, of saying no to life, and that this is a symptom of the sort of degeneration of Western culture, and that I think his sort of view is that Christianity was a very creative force, but it's got to the end of its usefulness, and now it's got to this mhm, degenerative stage. I think the kind of the biggest discussion of nihilism in the genealogy is in book 3. So if you're interested in Nietzsche and nihilism, then maybe we should do a week after the break and talk about book 3 of the genealogy, because book 3 of the genealogy is about what he calls aesthetic ideals, this idea of self-denial, as opposed to some idea of self-affirmation. And so the end of so in chapter 3, the beginning of chapter 3 and the end of chapter 3, he talks of the third essay. He finishes with man would rather will nothingness than not will. And I think that one way of in the preface, he says that the whole of essay 3 is the analysis of a short aphorism. Yeah. And there's sort of disagreements amongst Nietzsche scholars what this aphorism is. So in the preface, he mentions the fact that the whole of the third essay is the sort of is an extended reading of the aphorism at the start of the third essay. And there is something that looks like an aphorism he puts right at the beginning, which is unconcerned, mocking, violent. Thus wisdom wants us. Wisdom is a woman and always loves only a warrior. So some people think that this is the aphorism that the whole book 3 is supposed to be a commentary on. But that seems crazy, because it is really difficult to kind of see book 3 as doing that. The kind of new interpretation is that the first paragraph of book 3 is the sort of aphorism, and in particular, this idea that you get on page 97, that the human will, its horror of the vacuum, it needs a goal, and it will rather will nothingness than not will. Yeah, and so I think that it makes much more sense to take the aphorism about which the whole of essay 3 is supposed to be a commentary is on this first section, and in particular the claim that the human will would rather will nothing than not will. And so if you read it in that way, and you might think, well, what is nihilism? Well, nihilism is willing nothing. It's willing nothingness. And that human beings would rather will nothing than not will. And so he finished, and I think this is sort of, if you're looking for an account of what is book 3 about, this is what it is about. And I think the final section, like section 27, 28, are really kind of central if you're interested in nihilism. Yeah, because he talks about it's sort of offering an analysis of the attractiveness of nihilism. Yeah, so if you're interested in nihilism, you'd be interested in book 3. Yeah,
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions, thought? So I'll see you guys tomorrow, and ciao. Bye.